So, I want you to picture a scenario. Just imagine it is a Tuesday morning in late November.
Oh, setting a bleak scene already.
Yeah, exactly. It is raining sideways,
Yeah.
that really cold, miserable gray slush that just somehow manages to soak right through your coat and straight into your
Oh,
socks.
yeah. Arguably the worst possible weather.
It really is.
Yeah.
So you've got two different people, let's just call them Alex and Jamie, and they walk into their office building. They are shaking off their umbrellas, trying to get the feeling back in their hands, and they sit down at their respective desks.
Just trying to start the day.
Right. They both open their laptops, and right there, sitting at the very top of their inboxes, is an email. It's a performance review attached as a PDF. And to put it mildly, it is scathing. It is an absolute disaster.
Oh, man. The kind where you physically hold your breath while you're reading it?
Yes, the kind where you feel your heart just drop straight into your shoes. It is bad. But here's the really fascinating part, and honestly, this is the core of what we are doing today. Alex reads it, and sure, his pulse spikes. He feels that awful pit in his stomach. But by lunchtime, he's already made a bullet point list of how to address the feedback.
He's gone into fix-it mode.
Exactly. He's scheduling a meeting with the boss. He's sitting there thinking, okay, I messed up the Q3 projections, so here's the tactical plan to fix it.
He is treating the emotional blow as a logistical puzzle to be solved.
Precisely. Now look at Jamie. Jamie reads the exact same email with the exact same critiques, but Jamie just spirals.
The total opposite reaction.
Yeah. Jamie thinks, why does the boss hate me?
Mm-hmm.
This always happens to me. The whole system is just rigged against me. There is literally nothing I can do to win here. And Jamie spends the rest of the day discreetly looking at job listings, or honestly, just staring at the wall feeling completely paralyzed.
And I guess the million-dollar question for us is, why? Why do two human beings facing the exact same external stimuli, the same awful rain, the same brutal email, the same career threat process, so incredibly differently?
Right. Is it just a bad attitude?
Or is it that Alex had an extra cup of coffee that morning? Or is Jamie just having an off week?
Or is it something much, much deeper? And that is what we are unpacking today. We are really cracking open the hood of the human machine in this deep dive. We aren't just talking about, positive thinking or fleeting moods.
No, we are diving into a massive, really dense sociological and psychological analysis simply titled Facets of Personality.
It is a heavy stack of research. I mean, it covers decades of work.
It really does. It's foundational stuff.
And we are going to look at the internal machinery of control, the biological hardwiring of risk-taking, and the actual hard data behind what makes a human being happy. And we are going to do all of this by following three absolute titans of psychology.
Right. We are talking about Julian Rotter, Marvin Zuckerman, and Martin Seligman. And what I really love about this particular trio is that they don't just deal in abstract philosophical theories.
They aren't just sitting in an ivory tower pondering the human condition.
Exactly. These are the people who ran the experiments, who looked at the hard empirical data, and who figured out why some of us feel like we are confidently driving the bus of our lives, while others feel like we are just terrified passengers being violently thrown around in the back seat.
And we're going to find out why some people feel this intense, burning need to jump out of perfectly good airplanes, while others, like myself, frankly prefer a nice, safe cup of tea and a book.
It is a fascinating roadmap we've got. We are going to start with your internal belief system about control. Then we'll move into the literal brain chemistry of thrill-seeking, explore the very dark side of just giving up, and then finish with what the science actually says about living a good life.
So, to everyone listening, buckle up. Or I don't know if you're a high sensation seeker, maybe unbuckle.
No, definitely keep the seatbelt on. Safety first, always.
Fair enough. Seatbelts on. Let's start with the captain of the ship. We need to talk about Julian Rotter and this massive concept of locus of control.
Right. So to really understand Rotter, you have to understand where he came from. Context is everything for his theories. He was born in Brooklyn in 1916. He was the youngest of three brothers, and he called himself a fighting youngest child.
Which tells you a lot about his personality right off the bat.
It does. But the pivotal moment in his life wasn't sitting in a university classroom. It was the Great Depression.
1929, when the whole world just crashes.
Exactly. Rotter's father lost his business. The family went from living quite comfortably to struggling basically overnight. They had to join the frantic masses in the unemployment lines. And if you think about a teenage boy experiencing that, that is a massive trauma.
But for Rotter, it wasn't just a trauma. It was a data point.
That's the genius of it. He observed his father and the men around him in those lines, and he realized that personality isn't just this fixed thing that bubbles up from inside you, independent of the outside world. It is profoundly shaped by your situation.
So a shift in the environment changes the person.
Exactly. He saw that social injustice and total economic collapse could completely rewrite how a person behaves and sees themselves. He realized you couldn't just analyze the man in a vacuum, you had to analyze the man in his environment.
It's so interesting because the source material mentions he didn't even want to be a psychologist initially. He actually wanted to be a chemist.
He did. And the reason for that is quite telling of the era he was living in. He knew that as a Jewish man in the 1930s and 40s, the academic job market for psychologists was incredibly restricted due to systemic prejudice.
The doors were just closed to him.
Right. So chemistry seemed safer. It seemed objective. If you mix two chemicals, they react the exact same way, regardless of who is holding the beaker. But, as fate would have it, he attended a lecture by Alfred Adler.
One of Freud's really famous contemporaries.
Yes. And Rotter just got hooked. He switched majors to psychology despite knowing it was completely impractical for his career prospects at the time.
I love that. He ignored the external pressure and followed his own internal drive, which is deeply ironic, considering what he eventually became famous for. So, Rotter gives us this concept of locus of control. Let's unpack this for the listener, because people use this term a lot in modern corporate speak, but I want to make sure we define it technically based on the source.
Sure. At its core, it is the answer to a very simple question. Who is responsible for the reinforcement you get in your life?
And when we say reinforcement, we mean rewards and punishments.
Exactly. The promotion at work, the firing, the A on the math test, the smile from a random stranger. Who caused that to happen? Rotter proposed that we all fall on a spectrum. On one side, you have the internal locus of control.
Okay, these are my Alex types from the Rainy Tuesday intro.
Precisely. If you have an internal locus of control, you fundamentally believe that reinforcement depends on your own behavior. You are the active agent. If you fail a test, you say to yourself, I didn't study enough. If you get a promotion, you think, I worked really hard for that. There is a direct, undeniable causal link in your mind between your action and the result.
And then on the other side of the spectrum.
The external locus of control. This is the belief that reinforcement is controlled by outside forces. So, luck, fate, powerful other people, or just the sheer complexity of the world.
So taking the same examples, if you fail a test.
If you fail, it's because the teacher hates me or the questions were completely unfair.
And if you get the promotion.
It's not because you worked hard, it's, oh, I just got lucky or I was just in the right place at the right time.
The source material has these great illustrative examples from the IE scale, the internal-external scale that Rotter developed. It literally asks you to choose between pairs of statements, and they're surprisingly tricky.
They force you to choose a philosophy of life, really.
Right. Like one pairing asks, do you believe unhappy things in people's lives are partly due to bad luck? Or do you believe people's misfortunes result from the mistakes they make?
That is the crux of it right there. Or think about leadership. Another question asks, do you believe that without the right breaks, one cannot be an effective leader? That's the external view. Or do you believe capable people who fail to become leaders just haven't taken advantage of their opportunities? That's the internal view.
It feels a little bit harsh, honestly, the internal view. The idea that people's misfortunes result from the mistakes they make. I mean, that sounds a lot like victim blaming if you take it to an extreme.
It absolutely can be. And that is a nuance Rotter was very much aware of. The world is not entirely within our control. But purely from a psychological functioning standpoint, believing you have agency is usually far better for you than believing you don't.
Well, let's get into so what factor of all this? Because this isn't just about how you feel in your head. The data shows this actually changes your tangible life outcomes.
It really is staggering when you look at the studies. Let's look at job performance first. People with an internal locus of control generally perform much better at their jobs. They are harder to manipulate, and they actually have higher baseline self-esteem.
Wait, why are they harder to manipulate? You would think highly confident people might be easier to flatter or sway.
Actually, it's the exact opposite. If you try to persuade someone with an internal locus, they don't just blindly accept your authority. They evaluate the information for themselves. They rely on their own internal judgment.
Because they trust their own mind.
Right. Externals are much more likely to just say, well, the boss says so, so it must be true. Or the expert on TV said it, so I'll just do it. Internals are also much more alert to their environment. Because they truly believe their actions matter, They are constantly scanning for cues on how to succeed.
If you think you're actually driving the car, you're going to watch the road. If you think you're just in the passenger seat, you might just take a nap.
That is a perfect analogy. And this mindset extends to physical health, which I found to be one of the most fascinating parts of the source. There was a very specific study done on coronary bypass patients.
Oh, I saw this in the notes. This was about their post-surgery recovery, right?
Yes, they tracked these patients recovering from major invasive heart surgery. The patients who tested with an internal locus of control functioned significantly better 6 weeks after the surgery compared to the externals.
Was that because of some biological difference?
Yeah.
Or was it purely their behavior?
It was behavior. Think about it. If you believe you control your health, you actively cooperate with the hospital staff. You do the incredibly painful physical therapy exercises because you believe they actually work. You follow the strict
You
diet.
take the wheel of your recovery.
Exactly. But the externals. If you believe your recovery is just up to fate or God or entirely on the skill of the surgeon, you might not push yourself in rehab. You might think, what's the point of this pain? The source also mentions daily habits like seatbelts and smoking. Internals are statistically more likely to wear seatbelts and more likely to successfully quit smoking. They see themselves as the active custodians of their own bodies.
It makes complete sense. But I do want to talk about the flip side of this, the external locus. The source brings up a study of nurses in Germany that showed a huge connection to job burnout.
That is such a critical point for anyone listening who works in a high-stress job. If you are a nurse or a first responder, or frankly just working in a really chaotic corporate environment and you have an external locus of control, you are so much more prone to burnout, to anxiety, and to depression.
Why is that exactly?
Because you constantly feel like the stress is just happening to you. You feel like a helpless victim of the hospital schedule, a victim of the endless patient demands, a victim of the hospital administration. You feel like you have absolutely no lever to pull to stop the pressure.
And that feeling of powerlessness is just exhausting.
It drains your battery so much faster than the actual physical work does.
Now, before everyone listening starts heavily engaging in self-diagnosis and panicking because they feel a bit external today, we really need to talk about the nurture aspect of this.
Yeah.
This isn't fixed in stone at birth, right? It's not like your eye color.
No, absolutely not. It evolves over your lifetime. For one thing, age plays a massive role. We generally tend to become more internal as we age, peaking right around middle age.
Which logically makes sense.
Mhm.
A toddler has very little actual control over their life. A teenager thinks they have control but really doesn't. A 45-year-old usually has actual tangible agency. They have their own money, career skills, decision-making power.
Exactly. You slowly gain evidence over decades that you can handle things. But culture is the other really huge variable here. And we have to be very careful with value judgments when we talk about this.
Right, the source is very clear about not labeling one culture as better than another.
Exactly. The research shows that highly individualistic cultures, like the United States, tend to score much more internal. We prize the concept of the self-made man, the pioneer, the solo entrepreneur, the whole pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality.
Whereas collectivist cultures view it differently.
Yes, parts of Asia, Africa, the Middle East, they tend to score more external on these specific scales.
Yeah.
But again, that is not necessarily a deficit. In a collectivist culture, acknowledging the power of the group or the extended family or the external community structures is a deeply held value. It's about interdependence rather than sheer independence.
However, and the source points this out as a big however, there is a really interesting data point about immigrants navigating these different systems.
The study on Hispanic immigrants moving to the U.S.
Yes. It showed that those who had a higher internal control adapted much better to the new culture.
Because the U.S. system aggressively rewards that go-get-'em, highly individualistic attitude. If you move into a system that constantly demands you take the wheel, you fare a lot better if your personality already believes you can take the wheel. It's all about the fit between your personality and your environment.
So Rotter teaches us that believing we have control is generally really good for our health and our careers, at least in a Western context. But now I want to pivot pretty hard. We've talked about control. Now I want to talk about chaos, or rather, the profound love of chaos.
Ah, yes. We are moving to Marvin Zuckerman.
The man who looked at the person voluntarily bungee jumping off a bridge and said, I need to study that guy.
Marvin Zuckerman gave us this incredible concept of sensation seeking. And we need to be clear, this is a very different beast from locus of control. While Rotter focused entirely on our beliefs, Zuckerman is looking at a biological drive, a craving.
How does the source define it technically?
He defines sensation-seeking as the desire for varied, novel, complex, and intense sensations, and crucially, the willingness to take risks to get them.
Willingness feels like the key word there.
Right. They don't necessarily love the risk itself. They aren't actively trying to get injured or go to jail, but they accept the risk as the necessary price of admission for the experience. They want the rush, and if the rush costs a 10% chance of a broken leg, they happily pay it.
He breaks this down into 4 distinct components, which I found so helpful because I think in everyday life, we often lump all risk takers into one giant bucket. But there are very different flavors to this. Let's run through the 4.
Sure. First up, you have thrill and adventure seeking. This is what you typically think of when you hear the word. The adrenaline junkie. Skydiving, speeding down the highway, scuba diving in caves, mountain climbing. It's all about physical danger and speed.
Okay, that's number 1. That's your extreme sports athlete. What is number 2?
Number 2 is experience seeking. This one is less about physical danger and much more about novelty. It's the person who constantly wants to travel to off-the-grid places, listen to weird avant-garde music, hang out with eccentric nonconformist artists, try obscure hallucinogens. It's a profound mental and sensory hunger.
I definitely identify with that one a lot more. Like, I want to eat the weird fermented shark meat in Iceland, but I do not necessarily want to base jump off the cliff next to the restaurant.
Exactly. You want the novel sensation without the physical peril.
What's number 3?
Disinhibition. This is the letting loose factor. Heavy partying, binge drinking, wild social gambling, maybe some risky sexual behavior. It's really about entirely removing the social brakes that hold most people back.
And the 4th component.
Boredom susceptibility. This is the person who gets intensely restless almost immediately if things become repetitive. They absolutely cannot stand routine work. They despise predictable people. If a movie is pacing slowly, they will just walk out. If a conversation is dull, they will aggressively interrupt to change the subject.
I feel like we all know someone who hits all 4 of these out of the park. But is this trait inherently bad? Because if you think about it, some of our greatest historical explorers, our astronauts, our most radical innovators, they must have been incredibly high sensation seekers.
And that is exactly the key distinction Zuckerman makes in his work. There is good sensation seeking and bad sensation seeking. Or, to use the technical literature from the source, non-impulsive socialized versus impulsive unsocialized.
Break that down for us. What exactly makes it socialized?
Discipline. The good type is the career firefighter, the professional race car driver, the military test pilot. They have extraordinarily high, thrill-seeking drives, but it's rigidly controlled. They train relentlessly. They calculate every variable. They're taking massive risks, but for a specific purpose or a noble profession. They channel that wild drive into something highly productive.
But the bad type, the unsocialized.
This correlates with high disinhibition and high boredom susceptibility, but completely without the discipline. This is where you see reckless street crime, crippling addiction, severe antisocial behavior. It's basically the difference between a highly trained Navy SEAL and a guy who robs a bank because he was bored on a Tuesday. Both might be very high sensation seekers biologically, but one operates within a strict framework and the other just wants absolute chaos.
And unlike locus of control, which we said earlier is largely learned from our parents and our culture, sensation-seeking seems to be deeply hardwired, doesn't it?
Yes. This is where we get into the pure biology of personality. The expert analysis in the source suggests a very strong hereditary component. They estimate it's roughly 58% genetic. It's quite literally in your dopamine receptors.
Wow, almost 60%.
Yeah. It's in your enzymes, specifically one called MAO, or monoamine oxidase. Eye sensation seekers often have markedly different levels of this enzyme in their brains, which directly affects how they regulate their neurotransmitters. They literally, chemically, need more stimulation from the outside world just to feel a baseline level of normal.
So it's not just a lifestyle choice they're making, it's a physiological need they're trying to feed.
Exactly. And Zuckerman's own life is a great case study for this. He admitted that during his college years, he was all about, quote, drinking, sex, and hitchhiking.
The classic collegiate trifecta.
But as he got older, the physical risk-taking naturally dropped off. He wasn't hitchhiking across the country in his 60s. But the experience-seeking, the intense desire for new radical ideas and mental novelty in his research, that remained high until the end. The biology slowly shifts as we age, but the core flavor of the personality trait tends to stick around.
There's this hilarious and honestly slightly terrifying study mentioned in the source about funny bunnies and scary sharks.
Oh, this is an absolute classic in the field. They really wanted to see how early this sensation-seeking trait shows up in human development, so they decided to study second graders, just little 7- and 8-year-old kids.
And how do you test a 7-year-old for thrill-seeking? You can't ask
Yeah.
them to skydive.
Right, so they gave them a simple choice of short videos to watch. One was about a nice, funny bunny. It was safe, cute, completely predictable. The other video was about scary sharks, sharp teeth, blood, imminent danger.
And what happened?
You could perfectly predict the future high sensation seekers right there in the classroom. The kids who immediately chose the violent sharks were already showing that deep biological preference for high intensity. They wanted the hot stimuli. They actively wanted to feel something intense, even if that feeling was fear.
Second graders choosing fear for fun. That's wild. And the source shows this carries all the way through to adulthood. The behavioral profiles of adult high sensation seekers are fascinating. It says they drive much faster and they actually have significantly more car accidents.
They do. They are also statistically much more likely to have multiple tattoos and body piercings. They even have distinct visual preferences. They prefer hot colors like bright red and vivid orange over soft pastels. Their brains are quite literally craving more raw input from the environment at all times. A pale blue wall does absolutely nothing for them. A bright red room actually wakes their brain up.
And it dictates their careers, too.
Absolutely. High sensation seekers avoid clerical work like the plague. If you take a high sensation seeker and put them in a cubicle doing repetitive data entry, they will either quit in a week or they will start an office fire just to see what the fire department does.
We need the adrenaline.
Yes. They naturally gravitate toward helping professions that involve constant, unpredictable crisis doctors, street paramedics, crisis intervention negotiators. Or they go into high-stakes scientific research, where there is the constant thrill of the unknown discovery.
But the source does highlight a very serious health risk here, too, specifically regarding their sexual behavior.
Yes, the epidemiological data is quite clear on this. High sensation seekers tend to have a much higher number of sexual partners and consistently engage in riskier encounters. In the 80s and 90s, high sensation seeking males were actually identified by researchers as a specific high-risk group for contracting HIV and AIDS.
Because their drive for the novel experience just overrode all the safety protocols.
Exactly. They cognitively knew the risks, they read the pamphlets, but the biological drive for the new and intense experience was simply stronger than the fear of the virus.
Wow. So we have the captain of the ship, Rotter, who believes they are entirely in charge of the journey. And we have the adrenaline junkie, Zuckerman, who is desperately trying to speed the ship up and maybe steer it into a storm for fun. But now we have to go to a much darker place.
We do.
We have to talk about what happens to the human mind when you believe there is no ship at all and that swimming is totally pointless.
Yeah.
We have to talk about Martin Seligman and the concept of learned helplessness.
This is undoubtedly one of the most famous and arguably the most tragic findings in the entire history of modern psychology. Seligman didn't actually start out studying human happiness, which is what he is famous for now. He started out studying why organisms just give up.
Walk us through the foundational experiment with dogs. I know it's tough to hear about, but it's absolutely essential to understanding this psychological mechanism.
It started with a pretty standard Pavlovian setup. They put dogs into a harness where the dogs physically couldn't move. Then they exposed them to a distinct tone, which was immediately followed by a mild electric shock. Tone shock. Tone shock. Over and over. The absolutely critical variable here was that the dogs couldn't escape it. They just had to stand there and take the pain. They learned very quickly that the shock was entirely inevitable.
Okay, so that is phase one. They're conditioning the dogs to experience helplessness.
Right. Then came phase two, which they called the operant phase. They took these exact same dogs and put them in a box called a shuttle box. It's basically a room with a very low wall right in the middle. Now, in this box, when the shock happened through the floor, all the dog had to do was jump over that little low wall to the other side, which was completely safe.
It was an easy escape.
Very easy. Any normal dog one that had never been in the inescapable harness would figure it out in seconds. They'd get shocked, run around in a panic, see the low wall, jump over it, and be safe.
But the conditioned dogs, the ones from phase one, what did they do?
They didn't jump. They didn't even try. They just lay down on the electrified floor and whimpered. They just took the shock.
That is just heartbreaking to visualize.
It is deeply upsetting. And the reason why they did it is crucial for us to understand. They had learned deep in their nervous system during phase one that nothing they did mattered. That core belief that their outcomes are completely independent of their actions, was so overwhelmingly strong that it completely overrode their physical ability to just stand up and escape. They were physically fully capable of jumping, but they were psychologically paralyzed. That is the definition of learned helplessness.
And the terrifying thing is, they didn't just find this in dogs. They found this exact same mechanism in humans, too.
Yes. They did a similar study called the noise experiment with human subjects. They exposed people to a very loud, highly irritating noise that they had absolutely no control over. They couldn't turn it off. Later, they put those same people in a new situation where they actually could stop a similar noise just by moving their hand a few inches to press a button.
And let me guess.
The people who had been exposed to the inescapable noise previously, they just sat there, they endured the terrible noise, they didn't even try to move their hand to find a solution.
This has some truly terrifying real-world implications. The source material mentions a very dark connection to torture in the CIA.
It's a very dark chapter in the history of applied psychology. The source details how the CIA essentially adapted these exact psychological techniques, using things like waterboarding, sensory overload, and unpredictable, inescapable stress to intentionally induce learned helplessness in terror detainees.
To break their will.
Exactly. The goal was to break their psychological resistance so they would become totally compliant during interrogation. If you make a prisoner truly feel that nothing they say or do predicts the outcome, that pain just comes randomly regardless of their compliance or defiance, they eventually just stop resisting entirely. The source notes that Seligman was reportedly grieved and horrified that his academic work was weaponized in this way. He spent his life wanting to cure helplessness, not use it to destroy people.
And the consequences of living in this state, this deep-seated belief that you are completely helpless, they go way beyond just your mood. They go deep into our biology. It's not just giving up mentally. Your physical body actually gives up. There is a study detailed in the source about rats and tumors that I found absolutely mind-blowing.
This is the mind-body connection displayed in stark black and white. Researchers injected laboratory rats with malignant tumor cells. Now, normally, a certain baseline percentage of rats will fight off the cancer naturally. Their immune system recognizes the threat and handles it.
So the researchers set up groups with different levels of psychological control to see what would happen.
Right. Group A was given mild shocks, but they could easily escape them by moving. They had control over their environment. Group B were shocked and could not escape. They were the helpless group. The physical results were absolutely stark. In the group that had control and could escape, 70% of them successfully rejected the tumor and survived.
70%. That is a very solid survival rate against a malignant tumor.
But in the helpless group, the rats who had learned they had absolutely no control over the pain, only 27% rejected the tumor.
Wow. So the purely psychological state of feeling helpless actually suppressed their physical immune system to the point where they couldn't fight off a deadly cancer.
Exactly. The data shows helplessness actively suppresses T cells and natural killer cells in the blood. The brain essentially tells the body, we are already defeated, and the immune system literally stands down. And we see this mirrored in humans all the time.
The source mentions nursing homes, right?
Yes. Nursing home residents who are given even tiny amounts of control over their daily lives, like choosing what they eat for breakfast or being responsible for watering their own houseplants, they statistically live much longer. Cancer patients who maintain a fighting spirit, which is basically a sense of perceived internal control, often show much better psychological adjustment and sometimes even better physical outcomes.
This connects right back to Rotter, doesn't it? If you have an external locus of control, if you already think fate decides everything, you are basically priming your own brain for learned helplessness when things get tough.
They are deeply, deeply connected concepts. But Seligman realized something important. Not everyone actually becomes helpless. In those original dog experiments, about 1 in 3 dogs didn't give up. Even after the inescapable shock phase, they still kept running around looking for a way out. And investigating those resilient dogs led Seligman to his next great psychological discovery, explanatory style.
This is the whole optimist versus pessimist debate. But the source makes it clear it's not just about seeing the glass half full or thinking happy thoughts. It's specifically about how you explain the bad stuff to yourself.
Correct. It is all about the why. When a failure happens, how do you explain the cause to yourself? Seligman broke this internal monologue down into 3 distinct dimensions: personalization, permanence, and pervasiveness.
Okay, let's walk the listener through these dimensions. Let's use a really common example. Let's say I take a difficult math test and I completely fail it. How does a pessimist explain that failure?
A true pessimist views bad events as internal, stable, and global. So they look at that F on the paper and they say, I failed because I am inherently stupid. That's the internal part. They blame their core self. Then they say, I will always be stupid at math. That's the stable part. They believe it is permanent. And finally they say, and because I'm stupid at math, I'm probably going to fail out of school and ruin my entire life. That's the global part. It ruins everything else.
Oof. That is such a heavy, crushing load to carry around. It takes a single bad grade on a Tuesday and turns it into a permanent character flaw and a lifelong sentence of failure.
It really does. It's catastrophizing. Now, let's look at how the optimist handles the exact same F on the exact same test. The optimist says, I failed because the classroom was super noisy today, and I honestly didn't study enough for the specific chapter. That's external and specific. Then they say, next time I can just study in the library and I'll do much better. That's unstable, meaning the failure is temporary and changeable.
See, that feels so much lighter. It's highly compartmentalized. It's just this one test on this one day, and I can fix it tomorrow.
And that psychological lightness literally saves your life. The health divide based on explanatory style is just as strong as the rat tumor study. They studied first-semester law students, which is an incredibly stressful environment. The students who tested with optimistic explanatory styles maintained significantly higher robust T-cell counts in their blood during finals week. They also studied heart attack survivors. The optimists recover much faster and have lower blood pressure.
And then there was the nun study mentioned in the text. This is one of those famous landmark studies that I feel like everyone should know about.
It is truly incredible. Researchers got access to the personal autobiographies of 180 Catholic nuns. These were short essays they had written when they were in their early 20s, right before taking their final holy vows. The researchers analyzed the texts specifically looking for positive emotion words and an optimistic explanatory style.
And then they just waited.
They waited a long time. They checked back on these exact same women 60 years later. Now, the brilliant thing about studying nuns is that they live remarkably similar lives. They eat the same diet, they have the same housing, they follow the exact same daily routine, so all those messy lifestyle variables are perfectly controlled.
So what was the result after 60 years?
The nuns who had written their essays with high optimism and positive emotion back in their 20s lived significantly longer. We are talking about a massive, undeniable gap in longevity, sometimes up to a decade of extra life, just based on the internal stories they told themselves 6 decades earlier.
A decade of extra life just from your explanatory style?
That is wild.
And it affects daily performance, too. There's a basketball study the source mentions.
Yes, they took college-level swimmers and basketball players. The coaches deliberately told them they failed. They gave them fake negative feedback on their times or their shooting percentage. The athletes with a pessimistic style got measurably worse on their second try. They spiraled mentally. They thought, I just don't have it today. I'm off my game.
And the optimists?
The optimists immediately rebounded. They actually performed better on the second try. They treated the negative feedback as a specific challenge to overcome, not a final verdict on their athletic ability.
But surely there has to be a downside to being relentlessly optimistic. I mean, if you're too optimistic, don't you just ignore very real present risks?
You absolutely do. That is the necessary nuance here. They call it unrealistic optimism. Gamblers in a casino are the classic example of this. I'm feeling lucky. The next card just has to be the ace. That is a very dangerous mindset. Or think about alcoholics who tell themselves, one drink won't hurt me. I have it under control.
So there is an actual functional place for pessimism in our lives.
Absolutely. Psychologists call it defensive pessimism. Think about it. If you are hiring a lead safety engineer for a nuclear power plant, you desperately want that person to be a pessimist. You want them to look at the blueprints and automatically assume the pipe will leak and the valve will fail. Pessimism prompts rigorous preparation. It makes you double-check the parachute. So the ultimate goal of all this isn't blind, foolish optimism. It's calibrated optimism. You use optimism when you need the resilience to keep going, and you use defensive pessimism when you need physical safety.
Okay, so we have covered locus of control with Rotter,
Yep.
biological risk-taking with Zuckerman, and learned helplessness with Seligman. Now we arrive at the final destination of this deep dive. Seligman, after spending years shocking dogs and studying depression, eventually looked around the entire field of psychology and said, wait a minute. Why are we so completely obsessed with misery?
He had a massive revelation. He realized the entire field was entirely focused on pathology. Neurosis, profound depression, crippling anxiety, severe trauma. He asked the community, where is the serious academic study of joy? Where is the rigorous study of what actually makes life worth living? And this exact question was the birth of what we now call positive psychology.
And I absolutely love the little host note in the source material that points out Seligman himself readily admits he isn't a naturally happy guy.
No, he's a highly competitive bridge champion, a rigorous, demanding academic. He openly admits he's somewhat of a grouch day to day. He says his personal life isn't filled with bubbly, overwhelming joy, but it is deeply filled with meaning. And that scientific distinction between pleasure and meaning is absolutely vital to his later work.
Well, before we get to the meaning part, let's do some myth busting based on his data, because I think everyone listening assumes they know exactly what would make them happy. Let's look at the actual data points. First up, money. Does it buy happiness?
The data says it only matters up to a very specific point. Once your basic human needs are solidly met, you have secure food, safe shelter, you aren't terrified of a medical bill, the correlation completely flattens out. The super-rich billionaires are not significantly happier than the comfortable middle class. In fact, the data shows high materialism, constantly focusing on acquiring more stuff, actually lowers your overall happiness scores.
Okay, what about age? I feel like our culture assumes young, beautiful people in their 20s are the happiest.
The data reveals what they call the U-bend of happiness in Western cultures. Happiness is generally quite high at age 18, but then it steadily dips. The absolute bottom of the curve, the misery pit, if you will, is usually midlife, right around age 45 to 54.
Great, so that is something for all of us to really look forward to.
But hang on, then it rises again. 85-year-olds actually consistently report higher life satisfaction than 18-year-olds. They have gained profound perspective. They've finally let go of sweating the small stuff. They aren't desperately trying to impress society anymore.
Okay, what about marriage?
Generally speaking, married people consistently report being happier than single or divorced people. Having a dedicated witness to your life, a stable partner, really seems to matter for baseline well-being.
Okay, here is the really controversial one in the source. Children.
Yes, this is the deeply counterintuitive fact that always deeply upsets people when they hear it. Statistically, people without children often report greater levels of daily happiness than parents do. And if you track it over time, a couple's happiness usually drops immediately after the first child is born, and it actually doesn't fully recover to baseline until the very last child finally moves out of the house.
I can literally hear the parents listening right now yelling at their speakers. But I love my kids. They are my greatest joy.
And they absolutely do. But to understand the data, we have to rigidly distinguish between global life satisfaction and daily mood. Children unquestionably bring deep, profound meaning to your life, but they also bring relentless daily stress, heavy financial strain, years of sleep deprivation, and constant anxiety. If a researcher asks a parent, "Are you happy right now?" while they're cleaning up toddler vomit at 3 in the morning, the honest answer is no. But if you ask that same parent, "Is your life deeply meaningful?" the answer is a resounding yes.
Okay, one more correlate from the text. Internet use. Since we are all hopelessly addicted to our screens.
The data is grim. Heavy internet users consistently report feeling significantly lonelier and markedly less happy than light users. It connects people in a very superficial way, but it also physically isolates us and creates massive toxic comparison traps. You spend your day constantly comparing your messy behind-the-scenes life to everyone else's highly curated highlight reel on social media.
So if having $1 million in internet fame won't actually do it, what does? Seligman eventually breaks real happiness down into 3 distinct levels, which he calls the 3 lives.
Right. Level 1 is the pleasant life. This is pure positive emotion. Eating a really good meal, taking a nice vacation, watching a hilarious movie with friends. It's great, it's fun, but it is highly fleeting. You simply cannot build a fulfilling life solely on ice cream and sunsets. You rapidly get used to it. It's a phenomenon psychologists call hedonic adaptation. The second ice cream cone is never as good as the first.
So you have to level up. What is level 2?
The engaged life. This revolves around the concept of flow. You know that feeling when you were doing something, maybe it's gardening or writing code or playing an instrument, and you just completely lose track of time. You look up at the clock and somehow 3 hours have just vanished.
Oh yeah, I get that when I'm really deep into editing audio or reading a great sci-fi book.
That state is flow. Now, it's not haha happy. You aren't sitting there grinning the whole time. You are intensely concentrated. But it is deeply, deeply satisfying to the human brain. It completely stops the anxious chatter in your head.
And then we reach level 3.
The meaningful life. This is the highest tier of human well-being. This involves identifying your unique signature strengths and using them in the service of something much bigger than yourself. That could be a political cause, a local community group, a religion, a social movement. This deep sense of purpose is what actively sustains people through the inevitable tragedies and hard times.
And understanding these three levels actually led Seligman to significantly update his whole overarching theory later in his career. He moved away from the word happiness and started using the word flourish.
He realized the word happiness just sounds too much like a temporary mood to most people. Flourish is a much more robust, durable concept. He created a new model with the acronym PERMA: positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, and achievement. He argued that a truly full human life needs all five of those pillars. You can't just have pure meaning with zero positive emotion. That just leads to miserable martyrdom. And you can't just have positive emotion with absolutely zero concept, meaning that's just empty hedonism. You desperately need the complete mix.
But this source throws cold water on us at the end, noting that only about 10 to 18% of the global population is currently truly flourishing by this standard.
It is a very high bar to hit all five pillars consistently, but the vital point is that it is an achievable one. It just requires conscious effort.
So as we wrap up, let's try to quickly synthesize all of this heavy material. We started our journey with Rotter telling us we fundamentally need to believe we're the ones driving the bus of our lives. Then Zuckerman chimed in to tell us that, well, some of us are genetically, biologically wired to drive that bus at 100 miles per hour toward a cliff.
And finally, Seligman taught us that when the bus inevitably breaks down on the side of the road, the specific story we tell ourselves about why it broke down completely determines if we will ever find the strength to get back on the road.
It is such a complex recipe. Our personality is this intricate, shifting mix of our learned control beliefs, our raw biological need for external stimulation, and our practiced explanatory style.
But the absolute most important takeaway from all these pages of data, for me at least, is the learned part of learned helplessness. If helplessness can be conditioned and learned by a brain, it absolutely means it can be unlearned. Optimism can be deliberately cultivated like a muscle. We are not just helpless victims of our early programming or our genetics. We can consciously rewrite the code. You can practice being more internal. You can practice using optimistic explanations when you fail. You can actively choose to pursue meaning over fleeting pleasure.
That is the truly empowering part of all this science. It takes real, sustained work, but it is physically and psychologically possible. I want to leave everyone listening with a final provocative thought to chew on as you go about your day. We talked a lot about the pleasant life versus the meaningful life. If you had to choose right now, gun to your head, between living a life that was constantly, easily happy, just shallowly pleasant all the time, or living a life where you struggled, where you suffered occasionally, but you had a deep, burning, undeniable purpose, which one would you actually choose?
The historical data says the meaningful struggle is what actually makes us human. It's what builds great art and civilization. But the pleasant life is exactly what most of us spend all our time and money frantically chasing.
A profound paradox to end on. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.
Always a pleasure.
See you next time.